I'll give a brief intro just to welcome everyone to today's ConnexUs Thursday talk. My name is Xander Willoughby. I work on ConnexUs at Search for Common Ground. I've been looking forward to today's session ever since Luis reached out to me, and I'm excited to hear more about this. I'll leave it there and make it as quick as possible to hand it to our speakers today. So Randall, I'll hand it to you.
Great, thank you. It's great to be able to present this work that we did. We're going to do a quick round just to introduce ourselves. So my background is in peace building, and I've been working in social cohesion with a particular focus on Bosnia and Herzegovina and the post-Yugoslav countries. I consider myself a practitioner academic, and my sort of home discipline is political science. As a practitioner, I do work as a facilitator and designing processes and evaluation and learning. And that's how we got to this thing that we're presenting today. Luis.
Thank you, Randy. Hi, everyone. My name is Luis Monroy. I am speaking to you from Colombia. I'm a research fellow for the University of Birmingham, and I am also a academic. I work on peace building with a bit of experience in the Western Balkans, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and very recently, in the last 5 years here in Colombia, I study issues of youth conflict, mental health, and peace building, as well as transitional justice and reconciliation initiatives.
Hi, and I'm Valerie Perry. I am coming to you live from Sarajevo. And I come to this from a background in conflict analysis and resolution, and really an interest in trying to sort of bridge research, theory, and practice. So this endeavor was really appealing and really fulfilling in many ways. My academic focus is really looking at how through good governance, democracy, human rights promotion, etc., we can have more resilient, stronger societies, and how organizations can try to push those processes forward and learn while doing to be more effective.
So the format today, we're going to do about 20 minutes just to give you a sense of some of the things that you might find interesting in the resource guide, and then we want to spend the rest of the time addressing questions that you might have and what we learned from this process. I'll maybe just start off by just acknowledging that things are really shifting regarding development work and peace building and the HDP Nexus, and we're certainly aware of that. Some might say, learning is a luxury, or learning is a luxury that we don't have time and space for, and that's actually something that came up already when we were doing this research, which was finishing up last year. I think you can really make a case that we need to be even more effective at learning and improving our programming, and also making the case for why what we're doing is effective and making a difference in this environment. So I'm going to do the first part of the presentation, and then Luis will take over. So the resource guide is quite extensive, and there are certainly other resources like this. So we're going to start off with really what's really new about that, what's in it. I think one of the particular strengths of what we did was that we looked at 7 case studies that have a variety of profiles. We'll talk about some of them. We'll present, really some of the findings that we found, talk about what the resources are that you can find in there, and the recommendations, and some questions that we were left with. All right. So what's new in this? One of the things is that we were tasked with incorporating a co-creation focus and a focus on decolonialized learning. So that's something that kind of guided the way that we worked at this, and also the way we selected our case studies. So that brought in a certain critical perspective in the sense of attention to power imbalances. And also we bring our own academic focus. So trying to get useful information from the academic literature, but also not just kind of in an abstract way, but to really make it practical and to get into the practice, apply academic rigor and discipline to practice. We got into the case studies, which I mentioned, and we'll talk more about what those look like. And we really wanted to know, how does learning happen or not in practice? And I think a particular insight there is, learning is much easier within an organization, but in some way more impactful when it reaches across organizational boundaries, and that brings a set of particular challenges. We try to look at the question of accountability from a different perspective, not just accountability to donors, but accountability both ways, and what that means in terms of how learning can happen. So these are the sections of the resource guide. We'll sort of take each of them in turn. right? And finishing up with, so the last two there are learning and practice and the challenges of working in complex environments and then the recommendations. So I'm going to present 4 of the case studies. One of the things that I would highly recommend is to look at in an annex of the resource guide, there is a 2-page summary on each of these case studies. And this is a quick snapshot of who they are, what they're doing, how they're approaching learning, some useful tools, useful literature. It's very kind of hands-on. ConnexUs, I don't think needs more of an introduction. You know who they are because you're here today. The Caribou Foundation is a Norwegian organization, foundation that is particularly developing the idea of participatory grant making. And they work on supporting social movements. And so we found this is a really interesting case about how to hand power of the decision making of who they're going to support to a group of activists in the context in which they work. The particular focus of this is Africa. And what they found is that this had implications for what kind of things they support, what their focus is, what's the application process, how can they make it more accessible and adapt their process to make it maximally inclusive. The third one that I'm going to mention is Kvinna til Kvinna. That's a feminist organization. And there are some concrete practices there that other organizations might find useful because they really thought about sharing power with their partners, things like dialogue days, but also incorporating learning quite fundamentally into their organization. So regular program days, focusing on results, looking at after action kind of analysis and doing it collaboratively. And then the final I'll mention is Be Social. Be Social is a Colombian organization that works particularly with women's groups. And they are particularly strong on the co-creation and social innovation as ways of focusing on learning. So we benefited a lot from their experience. They do regular reviews of what they've learned and also trying to make space to make it okay to talk about failure. And that's something that we'll come back to in a bit. Some challenges that they face, the communities that they work with are a bit tired of research and have really come to the point of saying, we want to know if you're going to learn from us and benefit from our practice and our knowledge, we want to know how we're benefiting from this too and how to make this more of a two-way street. And these kind of social innovation models that they're working with are also particularly challenging to get funding for. Okay, so we're going through this fairly quickly, again, with the interest of allowing maximal space for questions. So I'm just going to do 2 sort of slides about some of the key things that we found. One of them is that, really deep learning takes time and space. And we were struck by even as much as monitoring and evaluation practices have seeped through the work that many organizations do in the HDP Nexus field, learning somehow kind of still remains like the bit of the afterthought or the thing that doesn't happen as much as it should. Of course, time is a finite resource. Another thing is the relational aspect of learning. There's an idea which I personally found very helpful of warm data. So in this framing, cold data is abstract data sitting in a repository or a database. Warm data is when you ask a colleague or someone like, hey, tell me how can I think about this problem in a different way, or where have you heard useful things? And often it's that warm data and the relational aspects that really make a difference. We looked at IT platforms. I think we found that these are being used more and more, and it can be really helpful, but it's also not a cure-all. It doesn't replace the need for intentional practices and reflective practice and also warm data. And another thing that came up repeatedly was systems thinking, which is not new, but its relevance for understanding learning and understanding how programs working in complex, changing, dynamic settings can improve on their impact. So there's, on the one hand, there's kind of a bit of a conundrum here, right? I mean, there's so many toolkits and resources, so it's natural to ask why one more, but in some way, I think we found it helpful to ask deeper questions and getting beyond just the people in the field are not doing the learning, or they're not asking the right questions, which is sometimes what we heard from from donors and organizations sitting far away from the context in which we're talking about. Co-creation is growing in popularity, but there's definitely a concern that the implementation of it is quite pro forma. So it's not really power sharing. It's not really including the affected communities in designing the programs that work with them. We also try to be quite aware of the constraints that donors face, the requirements for accountability and efficiency, also the changes which have only grown stronger since we started looking at this, to development aid. And there is we found increased evidence or increased interest in co-creation, and localization, but quite varied interpretations of what it means. Okay, with that, I'll hand this over to Luna.
Thank you, Randy. So I'm going to be talking basically about three things. The first one is a range of resources that you can find in our guide and how to access them. Then I'm going to look into recommendations, particularly general recommendations for policy actors and for civil society organizations and INGOs. And finally, we'll go with quandaries, dilemmas, and questions that we created, questions that emerged from all the different critical points of the guide. So let's start with resources. What can we find on issues of learning and uptake, learning in practice, and challenges? In terms of learning and uptake, you're going to find a lot of information on how organizational learning theory actually appears, emerges, and connects with the work of the HDP Nexus. So despite the fact that a lot of it comes from sort of academia, the business backgrounds, and discussions about institutions and organizations, it moves really nicely to concerns that are of humanitarian development and peace building range. You're also going to find a lot on localization and decolonization within the sector. So we're going to talk about in the guide on issues of how to address structural racism, the white gaze, addressing inequalities that have to do with discussions about the global north and the global south, and so on and so forth. And as Randy kind of pointed it out, a lot on co-creation, the do's and don'ts, the possibilities, case studies, and particularly how co-creation and social innovation are combined to create innovative methodologies that can, to a certain extent, address some of the issues of decolonization and problems of power within the humanitarian development and peace building sectors. In learning in practice, then we have discussions on how to prompt, how to create incentives for learning, collaborating, and knowledge sharing, as well as a range of barriers, the time constraints, resources, when partners don't have actually an information or a very structured knowledge sharing platform. So what are the possibilities of addressing and bringing that into discussions, dialogues, and processes? A lot on decolonial approaches to monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes, like Randy already mentioned the Caribou Foundation's approach to participatory grant making. So we learned a lot on, what texts, ideas, resources come from those type of practices. We also define and work on communities of practice, the use of virtual learning platforms, virtual repositories, and communication systems that through the use of technology help in share practice, share learning, and create things like lessons learned, best experience, shared experiences, and discussions about learning from failure. What spaces can be created to discuss when things go wrong and what to do with that type of information for reflection, for improvement, and for reshaping some of the practices in the field. And when we discuss and present resources on challenges, we talk about the need to create spaces for reflection and particularly how to get the best out of individuals, best practices, failed experiences, and in general, how to kind of monitor and move from that reflection onwards, but also the general challenges of learning and uptake in complex environments, things about lack of structures or lack of methodology and how to address them. When we go to recommendations, then we have, as I said, two big ranges of audiences. The first one has to do with donors, intermediaries, and then policy actors. For donors and intermediaries, what we kind of suggest is to cultivate intermediaries and actors that are outside of capitals. Particularly, we're concerned that colonization not only occurs from the north towards the south or from western to non-western, but sometimes it just props up its head from the urban to the rural or from the central to the periphery. So in that sense, the idea of seeking out actors that are located in those remote areas, or as in Colombia we say the territories, the regions. We also suggest to design partner contracts that permit collaboration and sharing information rather than competition between small civil society organizations or grassroots organizations, which is an often difficult trend that comes with partnering processes. And actually to incentivize and require intermediaries to commit to co-creation practices and methodologies, and kind of look at the best experiences around co-creation to see how best it can be implemented, designed, and make it really inclusive. The next bit is for policy actors, so particularly development agencies and ministries of foreign affairs. So we, in our findings, discovered a lot about accountability and who should be accountable and how should we demand accountability. So there's a lot of discussion on making accountability a factor that helps shift the balance between organizations and different actors. The need to assess relationships, with intermediary organizations to see the context in which they're operating, the realities and difficulties of like remote or very localized areas, and the impact that this has on the field. The third one is maximum transparency commitments and having responsibility and taking action for information sharing when it comes to publication, doing outreach and dissemination of the research that's done and the learning, so that there are spaces, sort of like what we're doing now, to effectively connect audiences and connect to the actors, stakeholders that are more interested in these processes. Also, when developing calls for proposals, make sure that these include learning, knowledge sharing, and adaptation as a key element of their format or their templates, and to also earmark in budgets and financial proposals, particularly for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, these different issues, allowing for experimentation and innovation. Additionally, we also, for the CSO NGO sector, we've developed a range of issues trying to stay update and follow up on the trends on learning, co-creation, and knowledge sharing, particularly when it comes to design, implementation, and evaluation, so that organizations are becoming more experts and more, let's just say, pushy or on the foreground of these discussions with donors, engage effectively with donors to creating annual learning budget targets and to consider learning as a marker, as an indicator when it comes to financial proposals and budgeting. Also think about prioritizing light forms of IT, of the use of technology and reporting, in lieu of things like language difficulties, connectivity issues, lack of access to the internet in certain regions, security concerns that can happen in very difficult scenarios and settings, and also cultural barriers that might emerge and that kind of emerge within technological practices. And finally, identify ways to discuss, to bring the issue of learning in all the conversations that you can have with donors and with your actor networks that you have, in order to understand what is needed for better learning and better uptake of these processes. Finally, just to close this up, we have a range of questions that appeared and that we saw were of huge concern for many of the actors and participants in our study. So first of all, there's a lot of talk about co-creation. We discussed methodologies, we discussed spaces for it, but our huge concern is it's great that we include co-creation in programmatic learning and it's included in certain processes, but what if there is no policy approach or no consideration about co-creation in policy circles? Then what do we do with that? How do we bring that idea of shifting balance into those conversations? That's a particular quandary that we have. The second one is to a concern with emphasizing on programmatic learning and sharing knowledge, leading to obscuring other strategic elements and structural elements, such as systems change that go beyond the work of the specific program. So not that programmatic learning shifts the attention and we drop other very important priorities in our different programs. Very important question. If everything's about shifting balance, how do we meaningfully address that? How do we rethink the relations between donors and recipients and the global north and the global south or urban periphery? How really should we address that shift to kind of change the power balances that occur from information, from decision making, and from resource sharing? The question, and this is very relevant considering everything that is happening right now in world politics: what is the future of non-colonial practices, or decolonizing or localizing practices in the HDP nexus, where we're kind of shaped by all these dynamics and factors that are ruled by sort of a privileged and unprivileged dichotomy, and particularly again with the rise of other political trends that we're seeing at the moment. And finally, what other limits do we have to learning? We've discussed things like cultural differences, time differences, technological differences, resources, finances, but maybe we're missing other areas that we maybe didn't have the time to explore and discuss. So those are the quandaries. Those are kind of our big questions at the end of the research process.
Thank you, Lou. So before we open up for questions, something I wanted to make sure to say is, first of all, thanks to the Knowledge Platform on Security and Rule of Law from The Hague, which was the one that commissioned this, and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was financing it. And maybe just to say, we get lots of questions of, how much is a body like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs paying attention to what you're saying? And we found quite a high degree of interest. It's also a challenging environment for as organizations working in the Netherlands know. But really we had an invitation even to write some quite targeted policy recommendations coming out of this. So there's some interest. That doesn't mean that it will get implemented, but there's some serious attention to the question of learning and how it can be better brought into the work of a large donor like that. So back to Xander.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now we can transition officially to discussion and Q&A. As people are writing them, the first one, and I think it's on a lot of people's minds, in sort of and you referenced this, and there's a thread throughout your presentation, but the field has sort of fundamentally changed in the time between the report was up and now. And I personally think that everything that you're saying is even more important as we're being forced and will continue to be forced to be more efficient, more effective, to justify our work for funding and policy change and things like that. But are there some core reflections that come top of mind?
I'll share a few. It is frustrating timing, and while I'm not trying to make any comparison to responsibility to protect, but I think a bit about that resource, which came out at a geopolitical time when it was simply immediately ignored. And so thinking about all of the lessons that could have been implemented there from a policy perspective, most of them were missed, but the document still stays there to sort of inform and contribute to thinking about these issues. And that's kind of how I feel about this guide. And I agree with you, Xander, as well, that one thing that we're seeing with all of the changes in the HDP nexus is just how many people who don't engage on these issues, who don't understand what we're doing and why, and how making sure that we go through the reflection about what we're doing and why, how to do it better, how to know what we're doing is making a difference, is important for us, but it's also something that's important to sort of get out broader beyond our bubble so that people understand in general how these things are all connected. And just lastly on that, while so much of this learning, I think, can really strengthen our own formal or informal communities of practice, I think that we can also just try to start finding ways to really expand that as well, whether it's to academics, thinkers, Rotarians, just people in our community, so that they understand all of these processes that we go through, since they are important for us, but also really important to learning in general.
I can chip in from the Colombian perspective and add a little detail to our discussion. So Colombia right now is probably the most impacted Latin American country from the cuts from Donald Trump and the crisis of USAID, due to the fact that all of our transitional justice projects and infrastructure was actually funded through USAID money. So the question is, so what do we do now, right? We're in the middle of this very complicated crisis, and the word on the street and the political word is network building. Make the most of the networks that were created through about 10 years of these experiences, not only with funders and donors that are working still on these issues, but actually between CSOs and between the civil society sector and the state. What do we have in our Nexus guide? Opportunities. We're talking about communities of practice. We're talking about how to share information, virtual learning platforms, knowledge sharing experiences, how to do better co-creation, where everyone is ideally at the same level. And I think that's the situation for a crisis like the Colombian one, to find solutions through those spaces, because we can no longer wait for a severe shift in the United States. It's not going to happen in the short or medium term. So I think these ideas of creating communities, of finding ways to share knowledge resources, can help address some of the issues around the projects that we have here on reconciliation, truth, justice, and other kind of issues that are core to Colombian peace building.
Xander, maybe do you have another round of questions?
Yes, I have a comment first and then a question, so we can. Yeah. Comment says, this is a great way of approaching the co-creation of projects. In the southern part of the globe, this can be a challenge to have the policy in place when engaging with target communities is key. Great point. And then a question, also feel free to raise hands and ask questions. I'll go ahead and read out the text ones. And Akram, I saw a hand from you, but then it went down. So if you still have a question, feel free to put the hand back up. It says, is it realistic or even advisable to expect every partner in the HDP consortium to work across all three pillars? How can we better value thematic specialization while still promoting coherence?
Yeah, my sense about that is absolutely, right? I mean, but that I don't see for me, one of the key things about the HDP Nexus is being more aware of the connections. That doesn't mean that everyone has to do everything, right? I mean, but it's a bit of working against the silos where you had a group of organizations working in one set of issues, another group of organizations working in another set of issues, and very little interaction. I think I can speak from my experience in Bosnia the best, where the question is, the adding up, right? Like how these individual efforts are good, and there's many things happening in a context like Bosnia. For many years, many things were happening. Now less things are happening, but somehow the connections weren't made. And the way we look at that is really the question of the institutional incentives, right? So organizations have been incentivized to pay attention to their own institutional interests as an organization, to maybe develop strong relationships with some downstream partners, and a really lack of that kind of systems view. So I would bring it back to the need for systems thinking, and let's be honest, that's hard, right? I mean, people face time challenges, as we mentioned. The work always needs to be done, and people will typically say, yeah, that's really, whether it's networking or knowledge sharing or something like that, everyone will say that's really important. Absolutely, we should do that, and I just don't have time, right? So I think the question there is, how can we shift that discussion and say this is essential, looking at the big picture, and how the piece that we are working on connects to what other people are doing is essential for really shifting systems, I think.
I'm gonna break a moderator rule and add a thought onto that. And one thing that we hear a lot as a platform on ConnexUs, and sort of coming from the peace building field specifically, is avoiding duplicative work, saying, oh, we shouldn't do this because somebody else is doing this. But now, as we're seeing right now, is a lot of websites are going down from organizations that are either saving money and pulling the website down, or just sort of information, just sort of raw information documents across the field disappearing, which just underscores our need for building those coalitions, for making sure that our information is shared with each other, both for our, sort of the value of learning and everything that you're talking about as well, but then also making sure that it remains accessible throughout moments of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
We're quiet in the question queue. I was looking through. I see we have people from Jordan, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Switzerland, a lot of different contexts across the HDP nexus, and then also geographic. So I'm curious if anyone has reflections on the discussion side, maybe moments that you've resonated with, or sort of maybe things that have worked in your context that you'd like to share with the group.
Maybe while we're waiting, just to say, one of the things that we heard about and sort of looked at is, what are ways, in some way the bilateral donors or the big donors, set the incentives that we were talking about, right? I mean, have often created competition and explicitly work with that competition model. And I think there's some limitations to it, right? I mean, the idea is to foster accountability through competition, and that I think has some weaknesses. But looking at how donors who want to can encourage improve learning, right? So donors, one of the ways is, some are working to convene the partners that they work with, right? I mean, that's something that's striking for me, is that often the organizations who are working for one donor are not really working together and sharing information, right? I mean, because they're seeing each other as potential competitors down the road, or whatever. So, I mean, how to foster learning, and also another thing we heard from donor organizations is that, the grantees are not very forthcoming in saying what isn't working or where they failed, right? Because they're not incentivized to do that. So, it's a question, I think, for the donors, big or small, how to create, sort of a safe space in which it's okay to talk about what hasn't worked. Because I think the experience shows that, until we can acknowledge what's not working and stop pretending that everything is doing great and wonderful, it's difficult to really move practice forward.
Thank you. We have a hand.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, but just to share an experience, I think thank you so much for the presentations, and that makes a lot of sense. We're learning a lot from what you're sharing. But just to share an experience, just about 2 days back, I really had an engagement with local national NGOs in Zimbabwe. So what is coming out is that we are talking about localization and decolonization. They don't seem to appreciate the way we assume they appreciate these two agendas. So that is the starting point. When you talk of the pledge for change, the charter for change, to them it was news. Unfortunately, we started with the pretest, and when we then did the pretest, people actually indicated that they were not even in the know of what we are talking about. When you talk of those commitments, those pledges, they didn't know. So when we then had some engagement, we showed them those commitments, what is expected of the INGOs and local NGOs. It was a learning moment for most of them. And as we speak, they don't have a platform where these people can come together to collaborate and work together to address these issues. So when we talk of localization and decolonization, this is something that we need to actually start addressing from the basics before we get to the level where we talk of the opportunities that we deem these people should be taking forward and running with those opportunities. So we speak of learning from co-creation. Yes, we can do that as an INGO, international non-governmental organization. We are able to do that together with a national NGO. But when it comes to them going for those opportunities, that has not been happening. So I see an opportunity where we need to start from the basics, try to co-create with these partners before we even go to the primary target groups. And then once we do that co-creation, we then go on into the learning itself, the documentation, the approaches and strategies that they are using are very important, but that has not been documented. And hence, this is the reason why I was commenting to say, we talk of these policies when we're doing co-creation. Yes, they are very important in principle and in practice. However, when you get to the southern part of the globe, There are power imbalances that are just extreme, that when you talk of these policies, they can actually stall the whole process. So we have been doing this, and we continue to do this together with the local NGOs, national NGOs, community-based organizations, to make sure that they are also part of the learning processes, the co-creation, and also strengthening their feedback mechanism. Thank you. This is what I felt I could share.
Yeah, thanks so much for the Giants. I mean, what strikes me in what you were sharing is that, I think there's a whole system of organizations, large and small, international and national and local, which are used to a particular environment and sort of the political economy, if you will, of this kind of work has been guided in a particular way with a certain set of assumptions. And the translating work that you're talking about and educating work sounds so important. Louis, you want to add?
Yeah, the Giants comment reminded me of something that happened in the workshop that we held a year ago, and we were all there. Sandra was there, which was, we were very wary of discussing decolonization and talking about this, quite openly with very high policy actors, with NGOs from the global south, the big ones, the smaller ones, and then, the methodology that we did was it taught me an important lesson, which is we got this World Cafe setting where we had key questions and key themes in different tables, and people created groups to discuss what was going on in each table. And in certain discussions there was a high level policymaker or someone from a ministry with someone from an NGO, and they started finding a solution or finding an answer that prompted a discussion that made them aware of their concerns and possibilities about these issues: co-creation, localization, decolonization. And they had to at the end kind of explain them and pointing them out. And it was interesting that at least we witnessed some level of dialogue, some level of conversation that allowed them to be aware of each other's view around these things. So it wasn't as controversial as I kind of feared, and it created at least an understanding of what it meant. Now, whether this is going to have a huge impact on policy, I cannot make that bet. But at least the creating of spaces where people see things from their perspective, but mutually they see a problem and they share their views, can at least put some of these concerns that Giant kind of mentions out in the open and start a dialogue that can lead at least to a better understanding, and then how to move that towards the decision making world. That's the key question. But we saw a space for connecting those worlds.
If I can just add to this too, when we set out to work on this guide, we hadn't intended or expected that it would end up being so extensive and so lengthy. But I think the modular approach is useful because some people from different perspectives, either in policy or programming, et cetera, or academic, might come looking for one specific element, like formal monitoring, evaluation, learning approaches, or very traditional approaches to this. But then they might come across some of the other issues about co-creation or about some of these other themes. And so I think this is a good way to help to even raise awareness among people who might not understand or might not have come into contact with discussions on these issues, so that they start recognizing how it all fits together.
Thank you each, and thank you for sharing, Giant. I saw a couple hands go up and down, so if you put it up, feel free to leave it up. We have a question. I think they've left, but from the Myanmar context of asking about learning processes in sort of highly volatile, ongoing crisis situations. I think sort of we mentioned when that feeling of survival mode, or when literally in survival mode, what are ways that people can continue learning from programmatic, improving programmatic learning? There's the words.
Yeah, so I mean, just to acknowledge that it's a totally, I mean, it's a totally different thing to sit in a secure place and have this, kind of comfortable abstract conversation. Another one to be in the front lines like that. I mean, in some sense, I mean, learning is more difficult, right? I mean, security for reasons of security and so on. But in some way, I think learning is even more crucial in a very difficult context, because information becomes so much more important, and knowing what's working and what's not working. But I mean, the challenge, I think, is how to do that in a safe way, right? Because in some way, the more broadly information is shared and the more people participate in learning, the more benefit there is. There's a network effect to it, but that also increases the risk. So, some kind of cell structure or some way of sharing information and reflecting on it in smaller groups would seem to be like necessary in that context. I think Lou wanted to add something.
Yeah, co-creation. If it really goes to the goal of shifting the balance, it happened to us with a project that I was doing with local communities in 2021. Colombia, by the month of May, had this very huge crisis, protests and violence all over the country. And actually, because we had created this sharing discussions and platforms with local communities, they use them to kind of mention this is happening, this is the problem, look what's going on in our territories. And it became a space. I was lucky enough to be in a university that helps kind of spread this around and connect with other people. So if there's this genuine idea of shifting the balance, then there are channels of communication, channels of outreach, dissemination that can help for them. Not even, it wasn't even our voice, it was them projecting it to us so we can project it to other people, right? So it was their message of help. This is what's happening. We need awareness. We need the attention of policymakers. I'm not going to say that I brought policymakers to the region, but at least there was this channel for us to know their concerns, to address them to a certain extent with some of the processes that we had and the budget that we had for our project, but also bringing the attention of policymakers, which as a academic, I had the chance to kind of mildly discuss. So maybe if we create efficient channels that are used within that principle of an equality in the balance, or a shifted balance between the bottom up and the top down actors, then it can help bring those voices, bring those messages around in those particular times of crisis.
You have last chance to. Oh, perfect timing. Yassine, I'll go to you as our last speaker before we do closing.
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot for this presentation. I didn't get the chance to read the report, but it seems interesting. One question is how to balance the accountability and learning and adaptive management, because sometimes, and in many cases, the donor enforce you to use their indicators because they are already committed to these indicators. So we have, satisfied them, but in the ground, the situation is completely different. When I see the learning, the adaptive management, I feel it is a magic word, which is not real in the real world. So how to balance the accountability and learning and adaptive management? Thanks.
No, I think that's a really good point. My first thought is we need to make sure that more donors have a copy of this and are thinking about and speaking the same language on some of these issues. And I think you're also right in pointing out that sometimes adaptive management can sort of be a way to sort of almost give up some of the responsibility for sort of ensuring that there's real adaptation and learning and an accompaniment process happening with the people who are on the ground doing the work. And really, what you're saying really points out to the need for these processes to be integrated from the very beginning. I was surprised when we were doing the research on this to talk to some people who thought that co-creation could sort of be tacked on at the end, as opposed to built in from the beginning. We heard a number of people talk about the frustration of having indicators or different measures of success sort of given to them as opposed to having been developed. And so while there's really no magic solution, hopefully the fact that more people are becoming aware of these issues will get a few more of the donors in capitals or wherever to recognize that they too would benefit from having a more realistic set of measurements that they can use to move forward and assess what they're doing, just so they can be accountable, just like you're mentioning. But that's a really good point.
Maybe just to add, I mean, the question about, we've got a common set of indicators and every project needs to report on it is something that we heard from numerous numerous points of view. I think the big donors that we did have the opportunity to speak to some people in these agencies, and the reasons for these standardized indicators are often that they are accountable to a parliament or to a national government. So, it's fulfilling something that's essential for them. So I don't think that we're gonna make much progress on saying no, that's not really helpful. But other forms of things in addition to that, right? Like, so, I think often what I've experienced is, we're talking and we're reporting in one sort of using one framework and language, and our real understanding of what's really happening and our evolving understanding and learning is sort of happening a little bit under the covers. And maybe just one final thing that stuck with me from someone from a large bilateral donor agency. She said, we get all these things, we get so many reports, it's a torrent of data, we can barely make sense of it, right? So I think there's my takeaway from that is, there's also a need from the large agencies to create space for reflection and thinking about how their understanding is evolving, because there are well-intentioned people with serious interest in balancing power and struggling to do that within the institutional constraints.
I would quickly add also our considerations about how to discuss failure, and moving from failure can help if that's the voice that comes from, things that went wrong, or bad practices. Oh, we catered for these indicators and responded to these priorities, but we ignored the demands, the calls for local actors, local realities. Then, how do we, through failure, understand that it is in the locality, in the more remote areas, where these indicators, these priorities, these actions make more sense, because they're the ones living the day-to-day perils, the day-to-day risks. And I think that's where a lot of the information that's more valid for effective responses can emerge.
I'll fight the temptation to add in a pitch for the Peace Impact Framework, but I'll say it into the space for people to look at it. Bali, we'll go to you. I assume that what you have to share is more interesting than my planned final question, so we'll replace it on the fly. Go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I'm Dubala from Ethiopia. So for the HDP Nexus, particularly for the learning, what we have learned, actually I work for USAID, but I'm now joining you at my personal capacity, the condition with USAID. So no need of that. So I work for USAID for the last 15, 17 years. And this HDP Nexus issue, we've been thinking a lot, but operationalization is very, very challenging. And as you have said, there are lots of actors, government and other development partners, World Bank, EU, GIZ. So what we have learned now is bringing, forward as leading this HDP Nexus, the local governments, subnational governments. And to start with, having their own regional policies and strategies for the HDP, because some of the initiative contributing for be it development or peace or humanitarian are coming from the different pods. So the local governments, subnational governments are in a better shape to facilitate that one. And the challenge we have that not is the capacity issue, and having a proper backbone support mechanism, which is not taking the the leadership capacity of the local government, but at the backside providing the technical support, facilitation skills with the government. That we've been seeing good results. And also for the measurement, unless we have a good baseline, like portfolio level at a given area where we are, and unless we have that baseline, it is challenging, to keep the momentum and also incentivize partners to continue contributing, because they don't have such any success rate that they are going to celebrate on. So we're lucky to have, Tango International non-resilience measurement, for which, HDP both, all the three mainstreams contribute. So the idea, what we have been starting, maybe the government will continue now with this context, the current context, is developing a portfolio level baseline where we are in terms of higher, bigger level well-being outcomes, where education, health, peace, humanitarian contribute, like food security outcomes, income outcomes, education attainment outcomes, so that, they have that baseline. And as we go, The idea was, to have, recurrent monitoring, particularly after shock, so that, we will see to what extent we are progressing on the HDP Nexus. So that was the idea we had, bringing the government on board, having a backbone support and a proper measurement as well with appropriate baseline. So in Kenya, we have seen good results, but that was only for the USAID financed activity. We call it a PREG, Partnership for Resilience and Economic Growth, because that was USAID owned initiative. So the World Bank, the EU, they were not on board. But now, learning from that one, we supported the Ethiopian government to develop a national policy and strategy and a subnational level as well, and bringing, the local government into the leadership so that communities also will participate. And as you said, the co-creation, they will be leading that one, but the backbone technical support mechanism, NGO or, research organization or academia support that effort. So we've been seeing a very good result from the Kenya one. Recently, that partnership result was measured and the government also acknowledged when we have, that collective impact, that's where we are getting, good dividend for our resources. So it's just, I want to share that experience. And recently we are also thinking to have HDP policy itself for USAID at a global level. That was the idea, to have HDP as a policy so that, it will be mainstreamed in the different countries so that it will be a working modality. So I heard you that you have now a guide. I think going forward, that will be also a good asset. We are planning to hand over the initiatives for the government to take over. So the guideline you developed also will be good for us if you share. I think we can share that one. And if some of the programs are continuing under the State Department, USAID is going to be dissolved, that will help us as well. So I'm happy hearing you and learning from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Xander's just posted the link for the guide in the chat.
Thank you very much for sharing, and for everyone who had questions, reflections. I'll give you each sort of a last moment to slip in anything that you wanted to mention and didn't get a chance, or something you really want to underscore. But just a huge thank you to the three of you for joining, and for everyone for joining us today. You all should have the report in your email already. I'll send it out again, as well as the recording for today's session. Give me a week or two to get that, but it'll be in your emails soon.
Yeah, just to close, I just say really thanks to the case study organizations that gave generously of their time, and that was really helpful in bringing in this very practical component. As I mentioned, there's a short 2-page summary on each one of those in the annex of the guide you might want to look at.
On my behalf, thank you to the audience. And if you have any interest in any of the issues, localization, decolonization, co-creation, organizational learning, I mean, it's quite comprehensive. So if there's any interest in further discussions, please don't hesitate to contact us. If you think there are spaces for dissemination outreach within your countries, regions, or organizations, please don't hesitate. That's our role as Pracademics. Thank you.
No, and again, thanks to everybody. Please feel free to share the guide widely. The more people who have it, the more conversations like this we can have.
Perfectly put. Thank you again, everyone. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you, Xander.
Thank you.